Hello friends, and welcome to today's video. As you all should already know, today we are working on practicing the steps of writing an ABE written response. We already have the first part of this ABE written because we did it in class together, and now you have chosen to get a little bit of additional help with the second part of the ABE. I want to start by saying that I really appreciate that you are watching this video. Being able to self-assess and decide where you are at in your learning is an important life skill. And so I'm super glad that you are taking the extra support that I'm offering to you to watch this video to help you write the rest of your ABE. Okay, so real quick before we get into our second E1, our second E2, and our concluding sentence, I want us to just recap the question to make sure it's fresh in our minds. The question was, identify the theme found in the telltale heart. Justify your chosen theme with evidence from the text. And the theme that we selected is that you can't escape a guilty conscience. And we said that it's shown in the story because the narrator is slowly going more and more insane. And eventually at the end of the story, he admits to the crime that he committed. So our first E1 and our first E2 that we wrote together in class really focuses a lot on the first part of our justification that we gave in our answer at the beginning, right? We showed that the narrator is slowly going more and more insane. And so now our second E1 and E2, we're going to focus more so on this second part that we came up with, which is where he finally admits to murdering the old man. I have already given you an internal transition. The internal transition is furthermore. And I've already given you a good sentence starter for your E1. Remember, E1 is your evidence. I put the text also states. So our next step is to go back to the passage and find some evidence where it actually talks about his confession when he admits to murdering the old man. So I'm going to go back to the text, and we're actually going to be looking at the very end of the story because this is where he actually admits to committing the crime. So I'm looking at paragraph 19 of the text. He says, "Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart." Remember, when we are citing evidence, there's a couple things to remember. First, we want to make sure that we are citing our evidence correctly. So we are copying it exactly as it's written in the text. So things like the punctuation that we see here, we want to make sure we use that same punctuation when we cite our evidence. And we'll talk more about that here in just a second. And also, when we are citing text evidence, we really only want a couple of sentences from the text. And I know that paragraph 19 doesn't look to be a super long paragraph, but there are several sentences here. And so we're going to try to pull out the piece of evidence that is the strongest and most clearly shows that this is where he commits to the crime. So if I'm looking at this sentence, what stands out to me the most is this part right here where it says, "I admit the deed." That is his confession. This is the point in the story where he tells the police, "Hey, I'm the one that did it." I think it's a good idea to go ahead and start at the beginning of paragraph 19 with the word villains because it gives us a little more context to his confession. So we're going to start with "Villains, I shrieked," and then we're also going to cite "Dissemble no more, I admit the deed." So I'm going to go back to my copy of the ERQ. This would be the moment where, as I'm typing on my screen, you will want to be writing on your paper. So again, we want to make sure we have the correct quotation marks, the correct punctuation. So I'm going to put my quotation marks, those two little lines. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky because if you look, we already have quotation marks in the text before the word villains. So we don't want to put two more quotation marks. We don't want to have four. In an instance where you are quoting a quote, you put your regular two quotation marks like you see here, and then you actually put one more. So if you notice, I know it's kind of teeny tiny, but I have three. So I'm going to copy it straight from the text. It starts with the word villains, and then there's an exclamation point. And I'm going to put one quotation mark again to indicate that there are quotations in the text. And I spelled the word villains incorrectly, put my I before my A. And then I'm just going to continue on with what it says in the text. It says, "I shrieked." Notice I put the comma just like there's a comma in the passage. Then we have another quotation mark, so we just put one here. "Dissemble no more." Scoot this over a little bit so that it fits on my line a little bit better. And I'm going to go down here. Notice I have my exclamation point just like I have it in the text. I admit the deed. And then we put our one quotation mark because that's where the quotation marks end in the story. And then we put our normal two closing quotation marks. Okay, so when it's all together, it should look like this. Furthermore, the text also states, we have a comma after the word states. We have our three quotation marks, villains, exclamation point, closing quotation. I shrieked, opening quotation, dissemble no more, exclamation, I admit the deed, exclamation, and then our three closing quotation marks. And remember, it's three because if we look back in the text, there was a closing quotation mark here. We mark that with one, and then our normal two closing quotation marks. So this would be a time, if you need to, you can pause before you move on. If you are ready, go ahead and flip your paper over to the back. We're going to take a look at our E2. Remember, our E1s come from the passage, our E2s come from our brain. This is where we are explaining how our evidence, our quote that we put here, supports the answer that we put up at the beginning. So remember, our answer was basically that the guilt was eating away at him, and so the only way that he could get rid of that guilt was by confessing to the crime. Anytime we write an E2, we want our E2s to be at least two sentences, and a great way to start our E2 is with something like this evidence demonstrates. And so we're going to tie it back to our answer by saying this evidence demonstrates that the narrator couldn't handle the guilt, because remember, we're focusing on guilt as part of our identified theme, anymore. So this evidence demonstrates that the narrator couldn't handle the guilt anymore. Remember, we talked about with our first E1 and E2, it's eating away at him. He's hearing the old man's heartbeat, even though we know that the old man was murdered. And so this is the moment where it all comes to a head and he can't handle the guilt anymore. So he does the only thing that he can do, which is admit to the crime, right? So our second sentence is going to say the only way to make we could use a lot of different words here. We could say guilt again, but since we use the word guilt up here, I'm going to use the word torment. Like the only way to make the pain, the torment stop was to finally confess to the crime. All right, so this evidence demonstrates the narrator couldn't handle the guilt, not the guilty, the guilt anymore. The only way to make the torment stop was to finally confess to the crime. So again, tying it back to the fact that the guilt is eating away at him, he has to confess. If you need to, pause the video, copy down the E2, and then we'll move on to the concluding sentence. Remember, the job of the concluding sentence is to wrap up your paragraph, wrap up your ideas. And so all we're going to do here is start with a good concluding statement, like, for these reasons, it is clear. And then we're going to restate our answer from the beginning. Remember, the question was, what is a theme? So we're going to restate what that theme was. So we're going to say, it is clear that the theme of this story is can't outrun. I'm literally copying this from what I put at the beginning. You can't outrun a guilty conscience. And that's it. For these reasons, it is clear that the theme of this story is you can't outrun a guilty conscience. So that's a nice sentence to wrap up our ideas and bring everything to a close. All right, once you have the second E1 and E2 and the concluding sentence copied, you can bring your paper to me. Again, thank you for taking the time to watch this video to get a little extra support. Super proud of you, super appreciate you.